to visit with Dusty Helbling. He is going to talk to us today about the beginnings of the rodeo in Fort Smith. So we're starting at about 1896, and we'll go through about 1932, right?
Right.
Okay. So anytime you're ready.
Okay, I just want to explain a little bit of the background too leading into this. We know there had to be events where there was riding competition between ranches and things. That was a common thing back in the 1890s, and it happened as like teams against team, and so this is kind of where it picks up in Fort Smith.
So are you talking maybe about families against families, houses against houses, that kind of thing?
It was ranch against ranch.
Okay, all right.
That's where they liked to compete and show they had the best ranch hands.
Okay.
And that's how it really got started, and along with some of the trail drives at the end, they would have that to celebrate and sort of get inebriated and have a good time, you know. But what happened was something very unique in Fort Smith in 1896. I went through 1 year of all of Fort Smith newspapers looking for a rodeo event, but there was none shown, and if there had been one, it would have been in the newspaper. However, there was a horse show, and I think that's what's really neat is a little girl named Annie Schaefer rode a bucking horse at this horse show, and Annie's pictured on the left side there in her later outfit with Buffalo Bill show. But Annie Schaefer's ride was the first exhibition of a woman to ride a bucking horse in the world.
1896 here.
Happened in Fort Smith. So this is something they had missed in history that people didn't realize till I started doing research at the request of the Rodeo Fair Board to find more background on rodeo in Fort Smith. Well, I was amazed. And so this newspaper article went worldwide. And I found it in foreign countries and foreign language in 1896 newspapers.
Wow.
So this put Fort Smith on the map as far as around the world of a unique
Well, and I would imagine a
events.
female cowgirl at that time would have been.
Right. And this is what happened. Buffalo Bill read the article too, and he contacts Annie Schaefer and her sister Lillian and hired them in 1896 to join his Wild West show.
Okay.
And then in 1897, also the rodeo board of the Cheyenne Frontier Days read the story also. And they come out with the first women's events in rodeo to be held in a public show at Cheyenne in 1897. And then in 1898, the billboard there shows that Buffalo Bill was coming back to Fort Smith with the two girls to perform at Fort Smith. So this is an amazing thing. And the interviews, she said she was raised on a ranch in Texas, and her father owned it outside of Fort Worth, and she grew up raising and working as a cowhand on their ranch. And they had to do it because that was the only way they could survive back then. Then we come out, I do this little bit about her in the If You Ever Lived in Fort Smith Facebook page. And suddenly I get a note saying Annie Schaefer wasn't born and raised in Texas. She was born in Germany, and her father was a brewmaster, and she was from Arkansas.
Really?
In the Fort Smith area. And I'm thinking, well, on her news interviews, she shows she's from Texas, and so I'm thinking, because being from Arkansas is not going to enhance the Wild West atmosphere, that they probably made the story up. Because the late Bill Schaefer, that was a history teacher in Fort Smith, was related to this woman. He passed away just a couple of months ago. And his daughter contacted me and said he had more family information. They had whip and some other photos, I think, and a letter from Buffalo Bill to Annie Schaefer. So it's still in the family. So here's something we thought, big event in Fort Smith, but Texas cowgirl, and she may not have been. She may have been originally from this area at the time this event happened, because some places showed her from Arkansas, because I thought maybe because it happened in Fort Smith, and other places, like in New York, they interviewed her. She said she was from Texas. So this is a ongoing research. If I can prove and get enough information that she was from Fort Smith and get a little more background. I also contacted the Cowgirl Hall of Fame at Fort Worth, Texas, and says, you need to research this, because this is the woman that started it all for you and your Cowgirl Hall of
Is
Fame.
she in the Cowgirl Hall?
No.
No?
They haven't done anything yet, as far as I sent them papers I had, but they haven't done the research necessary. Okay, we go on, and she goes on to ride in the Buffalo Bill show for years to come and everything. And the story from a magazine article said she died in Pennsylvania, that her grandchildren went up in the attic and found her attire from the Buffalo Bill show, and she had never told anybody she was in that. But they found letters and her guns and everything, and they said they must have been because she shouldn't be ladylike traveling with the Buffalo Bill show, and she didn't want her children and grandchildren to know that.
Wow. How about
So that's another sidelight to the story, and I thought that's interesting. And then later on, confirmation was, we had a young man born on the XIT ranch out in the Panhandle of Texas, which is one of the very historical ranches. His father was putting fencing up for him out there, and that's where he was born. And then they moved to Fort Smith in the 1880s. And he grew up in Fort Smith up till he was about 12, 13 years old before he left Fort Smith. He was one of those kids that was in trouble continually. His name was Milt Hinkle. And Milt was quite a character. He's been around the rodeo and the Wild West, the 1800s through the early 1900s. And Milt was playing one day with the kids, and they just had a hanging at Judge Parker's court. The kids were playing trial and hanging. Milt was the outlaw that they were going to hang. Well, they were in front of the livery stable on Garrison Avenue. They had a barrel set up, and they put the rope around his neck, and the barrel slid out from under him, and he grabs hold of the rope, and he's hanging on, and the kids all got scared, and they ran off and left him, and he's swinging on the rope, holding himself up from being hung, and hitting his feet against the wall of the thing, and woke up the stable hand inside. He come running out to see what was going on, and he cut him down.
Oh.
So this was typical of
Wonder
him.
if they played that again.
Probably not. And then from there, Milt went with a group of Texas people that came up, the ranchers. They used to bring their horses and cattle to Fort Smith to sell. And they trailed him in here, and he decided he wanted to be a cowboy. And at age, I think about 12, 13, he left with one of the groups, and they took him on, and I guess his mother let him go. He was nothing but trouble and wasn't anything here. But he went on to learn to be a range hand, and then from that he got into the 101 Ranch Wild West show, and he did some of the crazy stunts. He was also traveling with the Buffalo Bill show, I think, at one time when they went to South America.
Wow.
And when he was in St. Louis with one of the shows, I don't know which show he was with at that time, he met the Sundance Kid, and his partner there,
Butch Cassidy?
Butch Cassidy, yes. And got acquainted, and they said, you need to come to South America with us. And he ended up down in South America with them. And he claimed that the story that Butch Cassidy was killed down there in a shootout with the sheriff's department down there was all phony and made up, and they had somebody else that died, and they put him in that grave. And that was to get the law off of his tail for a while. And he continued to live in South America under an assumed
Cassidy
name.
did or Hinkle did?
Cassidy did.
Okay.
And Hinkle was down there with him, and he worked with them sometimes. And, so he later came back and was with the 101 Ranch Show for many years. And then he moved to Florida and started a rodeo down at Kissimmee, Florida in the 1920s. And then he became a rodeo producer and traveled around doing rodeos in New York and Chicago and some of the big places. And he was also telling stories of the Old West and about the people that were in the Wild West shows. And wrote a lot of articles in True West magazine. He was supposed to have been the only man to bulldog a steer from an airplane. He first did it. He first did it from a car, then a motorcycle, and then he climbed up out on the wheel of an airplane back in the 1930s while the guy flew over, and he leaped from the wheel of the airplane down on the back of the steer, except he had trouble hitting the steer, and he got his shoulder and ribs all broken, and was never able to compete in rodeos after that.
Ooh.
But he did do the publicity and promotion of rodeo and produced them. And I met him in 1970s at the Cowboy Hall of Fame. I sat down and talked to him for 2 hours. And at that time, I didn't know he'd ever been to Fort Smith.
Oh.
We never mentioned Fort Smith. We were talking about rodeo and other things. So that was one of the strange things that happened in my life. And then he and his articles wrote that Annie Schaefer was the first woman to ever ride a bucking
Oh, okay,
horse.
so
He was a verifier of that. This is part of a program from 1921 that I found when doing research that seems nobody was aware of, this huge rodeo schedule in Fort Smith. And the amazing thing was it's got all of the leaders of Fort Smith politically. It's got Alvin Tillis was the parade chairman. His the yellow letter there is one written by Alvin trying to get floats for the parade. This was sponsored by the American Legion in Fort Smith. And the shocking things, 1921, think about this. The prize money was $6,000. So you had all of the cowboys that were any good in the world, 45 of them showed up at Fort Smith.
So, just to insert this real quick, isn't Fort Smith still known as having one of the largest purses?
Yes,
rodeo world?
it's still, it's been there consistently for a long
So,
time.
okay, wow.
And so this was, in that time, had to be a fortune, $6,000. So everybody showed up, including some of my friends. I got to looking on the program, and here's people that I have known personally in the past. And this was supposed to be an annual event. However, it was only held 1 year. And another character similar to Milt Hinkle, but not from Fort Smith, was the rodeo announcer and promoter was named Foghorn Clancy. He was the first rodeo announcer ever, and because of his big voice and the poor microphones and used megaphones back in the early days, he had this booming voice that carried real well. So that came the Foghorn name. And it turns out we lived in the same block in Fort Worth at one time back in the 1940s. But I ran into Foghorn at the Cowboy Hall of Fame again, and we were sitting down talking. And this is before I knew about this information. And he's in the Cowboy Hall of Fame for being the first rodeo announcer. And Frank Heffley was a stock contractor out of Colorado, but his nickname was California Heffley, and nobody can figure out that. His daughter also rode bucking horses and trick rider too, so she was performing in 1921 at this event. And the next picture over shows myself and Denny Flynn out at the fairgrounds. Denny, the executive director of the Arkansas Oklahoma Rodeo Fairgrounds operation. Presenting him with copies of information about the 1921 history that's on display out there. And then I've got photographs of a big bunch of the contestants that competed here back in 1921 along with that. But one of them was a real cowboy, was world's champion called Yakima Canutt. And Yakima ended up in silent movies. He was a stunt man. He ended up as a movie director. And his son and I traveled together in rodeos out when I was riding on the West Coast. And his son, Joe, was a pretty good rider. But Joe and I had a little racket going. We were good at saddle broncs, and they didn't have many saddle bronc riders at all these rodeos up and down the West Coast unless you were in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Sacramento. Salinas had big name people. But we'd go to some of these middle-sized rodeos and win the money in the saddle bronc riding. And so what was comical in 1954, we were riding at Republic Movies Rodeo. And Yakima was part of the Republic movie team and had been in the silent movies. He was also the one that trained John Wayne and was in all of John Wayne's early movies. I've got pictures of him showing fighting with John Wayne and this and that with the early days. Well, Joe, we were traveling from one rodeo to another, and we were going by, and well, I got off on another subject there, but the North Hollywood thing, we went to that rodeo and rode, and they had the Yakima Canutt Trophy for the best saddle bronc ride. And it was between Joe and I knew he couldn't win, or if they picked him, it would look prejudiced that he got the trophy. So I'm sitting there laughing, knowing I'm going to get the trophy, and I got it sitting at the house.
Oh, do you?
The house
All
there.
right.
So Joe, I kidded about that. So we go by to see his dad. I said, I want to see that trophy that Teddy Roosevelt presented to him for being the best bronc rider in the world. It's a great big old tall thing, about 3 foot tall. And the Roosevelt trophy was. And so we go and I look at all the trophies, all of his saddles and everything. It was the first time I'd met him, and he was up pretty well up in years, and he was a movie director then. So we leave, Joe gets in the car and he says, do you see that little trophy sitting on the end? I said, the Art Deco thing. Yeah, I said, Joe, I just don't have much taste for Art Deco. I didn't pay no attention to it. He says, that was an Oscar. Dad got that for directing the action scene in Ben-Hur.
Oh, how about that?
With Charlton Heston. And he said that was comical because he says, I can see Dad, he's still sitting in there laughing because you didn't even know what you were looking at. And I says, yep, I says, that's embarrassing. But we went on to travel around quite a bit with Joe. He was really good. Now, he was also in the chariot scene. He was a stuntman too. And he and his dad both were in the Stuntman Hall of Fame in California. And so a comical thing happened. Joe's in the chariot. Here's this, the 2 chariots racing side by side, big crowd of people, all kinds of stuff. And it hits something that wasn't supposed to be on the ground, and it flipped. And Joe had flipped out and tossed him around. He likely got run over by the chariot and the horses, and he was banged up real good. So Joe was showing me the film of that. And I said, let's go back and see that again. I like that part. And so he says, man, it hurts every time I see that. I said, let's go back and watch it again. So I've got a picture of Joe sent me. He says, of that scene showing that chariot flying through the air and him out in space there. And he's written on there, stop laughing.
Let's go back and watch it again.
That was a lot of fun. So anyway, that was connected to the 1921 thing. I got off on some personal things I didn't intend to. But then we go on, the next rodeo that I found was 1932, and this was located on the ranch of the Williams brothers. And Leon Williams' ranch. And then John B. Williams at the same time was the sheriff. And he was rerunning for sheriff, so they were using that, I think, as a political event. Now, what is real interesting is some of the contestants at this event were later on, was Homer Todd.
Okay.
Was a calf roper at it, and his brother, I think, also was calf roper. And I believe John McIntyre was a calf roper and a bulldogger. And John McIntyre and Clark McIntyre, his son, were both world champions steer ropers. And that's the grandfather and the father of Reba McIntyre.
Okay.
And so I can remember Reba. The last time I saw her, she was 7 or 8 years old at a rodeo. And she was a little red-haired, freckle-faced girl that was full of energy. And Clark had a time keeping her. Clark was kind of easy going, and he had a time keeping her under control at these events. But I knew John and Clark both. I lived at McAllister for several years, and they used to come up from Kiowa up to McAllister to do their shopping and things. So, and I knew Clark from the rodeo. I'd see him around the countryside too. So I thought that's kind of neat. Got Reba McIntyre's grandfather was in the 1932 rodeo at Fort Smith.
Well, and I notice here it has event number 12, wild buffalo riding.
I don't know.
Did you really?
I've seen that at some of the events back then, and it was pretty rough and not too many survivors on the wild buffalo.
Goodness.
But they tried that some. And
They saddle them, or you just
they
ride them bareback?
They rode them bareback,
Holy cow.
just like riding a Brahma bull, except it might be a little bit more treacherous.
Wow.
But that was some of the fun things that used
Well,
to
really,
go
this
on.
whole program, there's the steer bulldogging, second section cowboys bronc riding. Those are pretty typical events.
Yeah.
The Pony Express race.
Yeah.
Now, that just sounds fun. So
They used to have different races, and just like at Cheyenne, they have the chuck wagon races. And
So did
everything.
they pretend like they were delivering mail? or-
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly on the Pony Express deals where, if it's sort of like the Indian races they have. What they do is they have 3 horses. Okay, you start out, you go on this, you have to run and jump on a bareback horse and ride it around the arena, come back and jump off of that horse, and these handlers are holding the other horse. You've got to run and try to get on that horse while they're running and jumping and pulling and kicking and everything, and ride around again, and then you do it 3rd time. Then you have to be the front on the 3rd time around. And a lot of times there's people getting run over, there's people getting stepped on. Those horses are all excited from all the action going on, and it's hard to control them. And that would make a real wild event for the spectators to
I
watch.
would imagine. And wild cow milking.
Oh, that was
Now that
always
one
fun.
almost sounds. Was
Yeah.
it meant to be funny, or was it meant to be?
It was wild. Let's put it that way. One of the guys would try to hold the head of the cow, and the other's got to get so much milk in a little container, a little glass or something, then he has to run across to the finish line. And the first one that's got so much in the milk in that deal gets across the finish line. Well, that cow is kicking and doing everything he can and twisting round and round with the guy trying to hold him by his horns.
I want to say I've seen an event similar to that, like that the clowns have done
Yeah.
in, more modern rodeo. So, and of course when the clowns are doing it, it's kind of funny, but I could imagine this kind of being the same thing.
It is. People get stomped on, they get
Oh, my.
knocked over. It's a wild thing. But that's the things up through 1932. And one of the contestants there was also Joe, let me think what his, can't think of his last name. Let me get this.
Sure.
And Joe Teague. The Teagues were quite well known. He was a horse trader over here in Fort Smith Stockyards for many years as he was older, and they were a wild bunch. But he competed in the rodeos at Fort Smith and around here for many, many years.
Is he in any of these pictures? Oh, there's an early one in Fort Smith.
And I've got a list of some of the contestants that were from Fort Smith around through the years that were here. One of my favorites was Earl Wofford Sr. He worked for the Will Rogers Ranch before coming to Fort Smith around 1940. And I first saw him when I was a first grader. He was bringing his son to school just after he had moved here from the Will Rogers Ranch. And he was a bronc rider and a bulldogger. And then his son was also a bulldogger and a rodeo clown. And he was around in the 1950s and 60s. And he died fairly young. And then another was Grant Marshall. Grant was a bull rider and a bronc rider 1930s through 1950s. And then he was a chute boss for the Homer Todd Rodeo later. And so, and then we had Ken Hargis, rode broncs 1930s to 50s. He lived in Colorado and moved to Fort Smith probably around the 1950s. So we've had some people, and then the most famous that people would recognize was Ken Bowen. And Ken was inducted in 1991 in the Cowboy Hall of Fame, and I was there for that because I had other friends going in also. That was Pete Logan, the rodeo announcer, was here for 25 years, was being inducted in the Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. So Ken was a bulldogger and a rodeo clown, and he had the horse act and the old gray mare. And you talk about making money. Back in the 1940s, he was at Madison Square Garden. He'd win the bulldogging every year there. Then he had his specialty act going, paid for that. Then he was a clown, he'd get paid for that. Then he'd go to the Boston Garden, and those rodeos lasted 2 weeks. And he'd go over to the Boston Garden, he'd win all the money over there. And he'd win enough at 3 rodeos to be number 2 or 3 in the world in bulldogging, just from those 3 rodeos. And he was really good at that. And of course he stayed on and clowned much longer, many years afterwards.
We have some pieces actually from his wife donated during his time as a clown. We have a hat and some of his clown costume and some things like that we've actually had on display here before.
Good. That's good. They've got some of the things. And I think that's pretty well kind of covers the early day of how rodeo really kind of developed here in this area.
So do you, without looking back to some of what I know at one point these rodeos eventually went to Andrews, what we know as Andrews Field.
Right.
And then over to K. Rogers Park. Do you know I know your research kind of stops there, but.
Yeah. One of the things I didn't mention is that American Legion Rodeo in 1921 was the first event held at Andrews Field after the completion of Andrews Field's construction.
Okay.
And it was 2 weeks later that the rodeo was held in June there. So that was the first one. And they ran up through the 1940s for a period of time. And I don't know where it changed over to that location in late 40s or in the 50s, along in there, was when the change would have been made. And I wasn't around at the time that they were starting out there. I was
So how
on the
old were
West
you
Coast.
when you got involved in rodeo? When you started riding and when?
16.
16. Was it here
No,
in Fort Smith? No.
no. I started, I rode some in Oklahoma and Texas. And the problem was, back then they didn't have high school rodeos. They've got high school rodeos now. You had to ride as an amateur and go to amateur rodeos to ride. And so you had to travel a lot more. I traveled hitchhiking by myself and travel on buses. And my first big rodeo was when I was 18, was Fort Worth, Texas. I rode a bus down to Fort Worth and entered the bareback riding. And so that was, I'd gone back there because I lived there at one, during a few years before and was more familiar with that. And so that was, my experience was going back. In fact, I never rode in this part of the area. I went from Calgary to Mexico City to Havana, Cuba, and the West Coast. Everything out west was where we traveled mostly. That's where they had more rodeos closer together, and it was easier to get a lot of them. And
Wow, really?
so that was the places I rode was Tulsa, Fort Worth, and over at Oklahoma City, I guess, closest I got to Fort Smith when I was riding.
So you were bareback and bull riding and.
Yeah, saddle bronc.
Saddle bronc.
Yeah,
What was your favorite? Did you have a favorite?
I like saddle bronc.
Or
but
which one did you? I guess you survived them all. So.
Yeah, I like saddle bronc, but I made more money in the bull riding. In fact, my best money was at 18 in New Orleans. I was riding there, and I had a bull called Big Sid that had never been ridden. I rode the bull.
Did you know he had never been ridden?
Yep, they advertised it, and what they would do, the producer says, "This is the bull that's never been ridden. He's put this many cowboys in the hospital."
So you like a challenge.
And well, I just ended up with that. So they try to scare you to death, where you're sitting back and nervous and everything. That was their way to keep them from being ridden. And so when I rode him, I got $5,000 just for riding the bull, because he'd never been ridden. They had that bounty on him, plus what you got riding.
How long did you stay on him?
The full
Did you? Okay.
8-second deal. So what I had to do when I got off was get my friends together, and I says, "Hey, I don't trust this stock contractor. He's going to be after me. He's not going to want to pay that $5,000. I said, "We need to get some help. I'd like you guys to follow me, go into the car when we leave, and there's that state trooper. Let's talk to him and see if he'll walk us to the car." And that's the only way we got out of there with the money. So with the state trooper there, the guy wasn't going to try to pull anything. But if he hadn't been there, somebody was going to knock us in the head and get that money back, because they weren't going to part with $5,000 very easy.
So about what year is this? Because that's a lot of money even now.
1953.
53.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I ended up.
$5,000 isn't too bad now.
Yeah.
For-
So and here's the thing about it. That was 8 seconds. I got to think about that. That's what got me really hooked on the rodeo business. My dad works all year for less than that back then.
Wow.
And I got thinking, gee, one ride. And then I I told the guy, I says, I'm gonna take a vacation here in New Orleans for a month. So I stayed at the Roosevelt Hotel for a month, and I loved the big band music. And they had Jan Garber Orchestra playing there, and then they bring in some other big bands. And I just stayed there, and they couldn't figure me out. The people, here's this cowboy kid, he's sitting here in the blue room in cowboy boots and deal, and everybody else is in ties and suits, listening and dancing to the music. Jan Garber, he's sitting there drinking the Coke and listening to the music. They thought that was comical.
You're enjoying the fruits of your labor.
Yeah, so, and the guy I was traveling with at the time, he provided the car and I paid for the rooms. And he had never stayed in a nice hotel like the Roosevelt. And so he went out, he'd met a girl a few years before, and he went out and dated her. He came back that night, and he come in, he took his boots off, and he comes into the room, big plush carpet. We had window wall to wall with big drapes. We had palm plants growing on each side of the window. When you opened the blinds, there was the French Quarter. And he says, my gosh, this must be costing a fortune. Well, back then, it was only about $17 or $18 a night for a nice place. And it was cheap there in San Francisco, too. And I was there for the rodeo there. It was very inexpensive at the hotels. So
You said he drove for you, so did you all leave from New Orleans and go to a next rodeo?
Yeah.
So circuit.
Yeah, I just followed. I drive with him part of the time, and if some of the other guys were going to different rodeos, we drive with different guys different times. And the last guy I kind of liked to run around with was Guy Weeks out of Abilene, Texas. He used to ride Fort Smith all the time. And I've got a story to tell you about Marty Wood was another saddle bronc rider out of Bonus, Alberta, Canada. Marty is world's champion, Guy's world's champion saddle bronc rider. They come to our cowboy golf tournament, which I didn't cover. And they were playing in there. Marty is one of those serious guys, and he takes the game of golf serious when he's playing. He's a small guy. Guy's about 6 foot, a little heavier built. Guy's no good at golf, and he plays in his cowboy boots too. And so he's just playing for fun, and he's out there playing, and he beats Marty. Had a bad day, and he'd never been beaten by a guy on a golf course, and it was really irritating to him. So that night, we get up on the chutes. Guy rides, makes a good ride. He comes back, climbs up on the chutes. Marty's ready to go and ride. And Guy says, well, Marty, I hope you do better on this horse than you did on the golf course today. And Marty completely lost his concentration, and he backed off, and he made a terrible ride. And Guy says, I'm getting out of here. He'll kill me when he gets back. He went and jumped in his car and headed back to the motel. I worked as an air traffic controller for 31 years. I worked on the West Coast and around the country after my rodeo career was over. And while working at Fort Smith in 1969, we were requested to go to Fayetteville for the Arkansas-Texas football game. At that time, they didn't have a control tower, and they needed air traffic control at Fayetteville. So myself, one other controller, and the tire chief get in the car, and we drive up to Fayetteville for that. The day before, we'd had a meeting with the Secret Service and with the helicopter pilots that were going to be shuttling the president, the senators, and the news media from Fort Smith by helicopter to Fayetteville because their planes couldn't land up there. The size were too large for the airport. We had a terrible time getting up there because of the fog on the highway. Real nasty weather, which was going to cut our job down a lot because they have to make an instant approach to get into Fayetteville. Otherwise, we'd had 500 to 700 airplanes flying all over the place up there in the air. So we were sort of happy that our job wasn't going to be quite as difficult. So the Secret Service goes over everything. We got everything settled down. We talked to the Marine pilots. Says, okay, how much altitude would you like for us to block between Fort Smith and Fayetteville for you? They said, we won't need any blockage. We're experienced Vietnam veteran pilots. We can fly in anything. We says, oh boy. So we go back after it's over with, and the tower chief and sit down and says, we better block up to 6,000 feet, just in case, for safety's sake. And so we called the Memphis Control Center, says block everything between Fort Smith and Fayetteville from 6,000 and below, bring everybody above 6,000 coming in for their approach to Fayetteville. And they says, okay. Well, the helicopter pilots take off with the president. The second helicopter took off with senators and congressmen. The third helicopter takes off with the news media. They're going to fly up Highway 71 to Fayetteville. Well, they take off because of low altitude. We lose communication with them out of Fort Smith fairly soon. And we're waiting at Fayetteville for them up there and watching for them. They call us and says, hey, we've lost radio down there. Y'all be on the lookout for those helicopters coming up there. And we says, okay. And we call the Memphis Control Center and see if their radar was showing anything. They says, no. I says, well, they're too low. They're following the highway. Our first communication was with the Marine One carrying the President of the United States saying, we need an instrument clearance. We're climbing through the clouds, going through 2,500 feet. And so we clear them up to 4,000 feet and up to Fayetteville. We said, where's the other helicopters? Says, we don't know. They're in the fog here with us. We can't see nothing. We can't see the ground or hills. They got the President of the United States on board. And so they were talking to each other because they couldn't talk to anybody else. They said they were trying to separate themselves by 200 feet going up altitude. They couldn't see each other, didn't know where each other were, but they were hoping for the best. They couldn't see the hills. They didn't know what was around. And here they are climbing up through the deals, and we were ahead of the game, so we got them in. The second helicopter gets up high enough that our radios reach him. We talk to him, we give him a clearance following the other and everything. And so the third helicopter gets up. Here we got them all coming 500 feet apart, altitude-wise, and probably 3 or 4 or 5 miles. There's supposed to be 10 miles between them coming in, but we were under an emergency situation, we felt. And so we got them in. The president's helicopter makes an instrument approach. He sees the air, didn't get to the airport, but he saw the stadium as he was making his approach coming down through the clouds. And he broke off to land, and we've got all the Secret Service people down there, and we're setting up on top of the building in a little temporary shelter with a microphone and radio and telephones to the White House and to the Memphis Control Center. And the Secret Service waiting for a signal. Do they go to the football stadium or is he going to come in here? So they're down there, and we say, and they all run and jump in the cars, and here goes a big convoy of Secret Service heading up to the football stadium. And then the other 2 helicopters make instant approach. It takes them, they come in about 10, 15 minutes later, and they land, and then the next one comes in another 15 minutes later, and he lands. And they all off unload. Well, we get back to Fort Smith after the day was over with. Arkansas lost 15-14 in the big shootout. Of Texas was #1, Arkansas #2, so it looked like pretty accurate ratings. And the tower chief says, well, I'm glad we got through that. And I says, aren't we going to file a violation against Marine helicopters for endangering the lives of the United States President, senators, congressmen, and the news media? And he says, oh no, we can't do that. If we do that, there'll be a big investigation. They'll come down and fire us all. And I said, we didn't do nothing. It's the Marines that did that were overbearing and said they didn't need that endangered his life and everybody else's life. And so about, I guess, 4 or 5 years ago, I was sitting on a golf cart with David Pryor at a golf event, and we're talking. I says, "Do you remember that football game?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "We never did know what was going on." I says, "The Marine pilots didn't have the guts to tell you what was going on." I said, "You people were lucky to be alive today." And I said, and I told him the story. He says, "My gosh, I can't believe that." And I says, "Yeah." And he wanted me to go to Fayetteville up to the Pryor Center and record that. And it hasn't been done yet. So this is the first time I told the story.
We got it here now, but what an incredible story.
But that was the wildest thing I've ever seen.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Really, that is quite a story.
I just thought, man, I couldn't believe what they did, and got into a position where they couldn't see each other, even though they were tailing each other close together and trying to keep an eye on the road. They couldn't even see the road, and they couldn't see no hills. They didn't know if they were flying into a hill or not. I mean, they were just outright lucky.
So they started out trying to follow Old 71?
Yeah,
So visually follow the old
visually
highway.
follow. They said, "We don't need an instrument clearance. We're going to cut it short." They didn't want to get up there and have to make an instrument approach and spend an extra 15 to 20 minutes doing that.
Well, how lucky were they that you all were there?
Yeah, that, and that
Well,
our
at least how lucky
radios
was
were
the
working.
president and the congressman and the media that.
Yeah, well, I talked to Nixon after he got on the ground, and I didn't tell him what happened.
So they weren't very aware of exactly what kind of
No, the
danger
president
they
didn't
were
know
in?
anything about what happened. They just thought those guys had everything controlled up in the
Yeah,
front.
well, you hope that they do. So.
And they weren't definitely gonna say anything. But what's comical is, I'm sitting there, the tired chief was on the phone talking to the news media. The other guy was talking to the airplane, and the White House phone rings, and the chief figures, well, they're calling, won't know where the president is again. I pick up the phone, and the guy says, "I need you to do me a favor." He says, "I need you to meet such and such oil company airplane number such and such coming in from Houston, and relay this message to Mr. So-and-so. He says, "Do this personally. I don't want anybody else to hear it." I says, "All right." And so when I first pick up, I says, "Tyra, can I help you?" And the chief says, "You talk to the president of the United States like that?" And I said, "He didn't tell me who he was." I didn't know until he started talking. I recognized his voice. I said, "I can handle that." "Yes, sir." "No problem." He says, "Give me the message." I says, "I can't do it because he told me not to." And the chief was mad because he wanted to be the hero to go down the deal. He was trying to be the top dog, and he should have been, but I was being nasty because I like to irritate him once in a while. And that was funny.
Well, I like the hand signal too. They want to know where they're going to land, and you.
Yeah, we do. The way we developed that, and later on, when the Gerald Ford came into Fort Smith, I was going to work, and it was real comical. I'm going in at 2 o'clock, and he'd already been on the ground, and his plane would be leaving in a little while. Okay, I'm coming into the tire from the backside off of 0th Street, and they got state trooper down there to block the road because they had all security around the airport. I get down there. He says, "Where are you going?" I says, "I was wanting to go to the control tower." He says, "You got an identification?" I said, "Yes, sir." I reached down, I pulled out my Swiss passport, gave him that. He didn't know what to do. He called the tower, says, "We got somebody down here that's got a Swiss passport by such and such a name." He says, "Oh, that stupid jerk, hey, let the guy in. He's supposed to be here at 2 o'clock. He's holding up the show. Tell him to get up here. I want to get off from work." and so,
Stir up a little bit of
yeah,
trouble.
so I thought I'd add a little to. I get up there, and the guy from the Nixon, Secret Service agent from Nixon's deal that I got acquainted with, was up there. He's working across the control tower, and I come in with this big sack. He says, "Hey, how you doing?" I said, "Doing great. You back here again?" And he says, "Yep, another presidential trip." I says, "That's great." I says, "I came prepared for this one. pulled out a bag of popcorn, handed him a bag of popcorn. I says, let's watch the show.
You've been there, done that, you knew what was coming.
And so he was, I had a lot of fun with those Secret Service guys. They were fun. They get pretty serious, you know, and you try to, but that was part of air traffic control. You had to have a crazy deal because they would drive you nuts with situations that you'd get into, and you're sweating out somebody if they're going to crash or whatever. And I guess 15 to 20 years after I retired in 1984, I'd wake up middle of the night, cold sweat from a plane crash, and I'm trying to get the people out of the wreckage of the plane is burning, and I'm rushing down trying to get them out. Because I'd seen a number of plane crashes, people killed coming in. And that used to, I never did that when I was working, but after years, it'd come back.
Your great stories. Thank you for doing this. Is this light bothering you too much?
No, it doesn't bother me.
Okay.
I'm used to being in lineup, so.